Champi won European cinema in the 1970s didn't just push boundaries, it obliterated them. While Hollywood was busy making blockbusters, filmmakers across France, Italy, and Germany were quietly creating works so disturbing, so politically explosive, that governments literally seized the prints. These 10 films were banned, burned, and buried. Now they're free to watch. The question is, are you ready? Salò, or the 120 Days of Sodom, 1975. The last film Pier Paolo Pasolini ever made was also the one that got him murdered. Well, officially he was killed before its release under murky circumstances that Italian authorities never fully resolved, but the timing has haunted film scholars ever since. Salò arrived in 1975 like a hand grenade thrown into a crowded theater, and nearly 5 decades later, it still clears rooms. This is not a film you watch for entertainment. You watch it because it is one of the most uncompromising political statements ever committed to celluloid. Pasolini transplanted the Marquis de Sade's 18th century text into fascist Italy, 1944, where 4 powerful libertines kidnap 18 teenagers and subject them to 4 months of escalating ritual degradation. The structure is borrowed directly from Dante's Inferno, the circle of manias, the circle of filth, the circle of blood. It sounds like an art school framework, and it is, but Pasolini weaponizes that structure to make an airtight argument. Power corrupts absolutely, and fascism is not a political system, but a fundamental perversion of human dignity. Italy banned it almost immediately. Britain's Video Recordings Act kept it off shelves for decades. Australia refused classification multiple times. The British Film Institute eventually placed it on their list of the 100 greatest films ever made, which tells you everything about how deeply cinema's relationship with this film has transformed over time. Roger Ebert, who famously gave it a rare 0-star review in 1976, later revisited the film and acknowledged its undeniable importance. That reversal is itself a story. Critics who dismissed it as filth spent the next 20 years quietly walking those opinions back. The Criterion Collection eventually gave it a restoration that would make most prestige dramas jealous. What makes Salò essential viewing is not what it shows, it is what it refuses to let you look away from. Pasolini forces complicity. You sit there, you watch, and then you have to ask yourself what that says about the systems of power you quietly accept every single day. Free on multiple platforms. Watch it once. You will never stop thinking about it. The Wicker Man, 1973. Before Hollywood remade it into a Nicolas Cage meme, The Wicker Man was a genuinely terrifying piece of British folk horror that the studio tried to bury in a motorway embankment. Literally. According to persistent legend, the original prints were dumped beneath the M3 motorway during construction. The studio, British Lion, had no faith in it and released it as a B-picture supporting feature. Director Robin Hardy and star Christopher Lee were so furious they spent years campaigning to restore the film to its original cut. Christopher Lee has gone on record calling The Wicker Man the finest film he ever made. This is a man who appeared in over 250 productions, who played Dracula, Saruman, and Count Dooku, and his personal gold standard was a low-budget British folk horror that almost never saw a proper release. That tells you something extraordinary about what Hardy created here. Sergeant Neil Howie, a devout Christian police officer, travels to the remote Scottish island of Summerisle to investigate the disappearance of a young girl. What he finds is a pagan community that has completely abandoned Christianity in favor of old gods, ritual fertility ceremonies, and a disturbingly cheerful indifference to his authority. The film builds its dread not through jump scares or gore, but through wrongness. Everything is slightly off. The locals are too welcoming. The children sing strange songs. And the climax, which anyone who has ever heard of this film already knows, remains one of the most genuinely shocking endings in the history of British cinema. The film was only rescued from obscurity because a dedicated print was discovered and restored in the 1970s and 1980s. Multiple cuts exist, ranging from 87 minutes to over 100 minutes. Cinephiles still debate which version is definitive. The full director's cut, when it appears on streaming platforms, is the one you want. It earned cult status not through controversy alone, but through genuine craft. Hardy's direction is meticulous. The folk songs composed by Paul Giovanni are hauntingly beautiful, and Edward Woodward's performance as a man whose faith becomes his undoing is one of the great underrated turns in British cinema history. Suspiria, 1977. There is a famous story about Dario Argento preparing his crew for Suspiria by explaining that it would be a fairy tale for adults. Then he proceeded to create one of the most visually hallucinatory horror films ever made, something that functions less like a narrative and more like a fever dream you cannot wake up from. The cinematographer Luciano Tovoli shot the film using a 3-strip Technicolor process that had been largely abandoned since the 1960s because it produced colors that looked almost physically impossible. Reds that bleed off the screen, blues that feel like drowning. The film looks like no other horror film before or since. An American student arrives at a prestigious German dance academy and immediately starts suspecting that something deeply wrong lives inside its walls. The plot, by traditional standards, barely holds together. Argento himself admitted that logic was not the priority. He wanted emotional truth, visceral sensation, the feeling of a nightmare made architectural, and he achieved it completely. The band Goblin created a score that is almost a character in itself, a relentless, percussive, chanting wall of sound that makes it impossible to feel safe. When Suspiria was released in Italy in 1977, it broke box office records. In America, it became a midnight movie legend, the kind of film that people drove hours to see at single-screen theaters. Martin Scorsese has cited it as one of his great influences. Guillermo del Toro considers Argento one of the essential visual artists of the 20th century. The film was banned in several countries for the intensity of its opening murder sequence, which Argento has described as the most important scene he ever filmed. He needed to establish in the first 10 minutes that no one in this world was safe. He succeeded. Luca Guadagnino remade it in 2018 to deeply divided response, which only reinforced how irreplaceable the original remains. The 4K restoration now streaming in several territories makes those impossible. Technicolor images look even more overwhelming than they did in 1977. Aguirre, The Wrath of God, 1972. Werner Herzog wrote the script for Aguirre, The Wrath of God, in 2.5 days on a bus. He then took a crew into the Peruvian jungle with no money, no permits, and Klaus Kinski, an actor so volatile that Herzog has since admitted he considered murdering him on multiple occasions. What emerged from that chaos is one of the most gripping, philosophically devastating films about obsession and empire ever made. It was produced for roughly 370,000 Deutsche Marks. Films with 1,000 times that budget have produced a fraction of its impact. Kinski plays Don Lope de Aguirre, a Spanish conquistador who joins an expedition into the Amazon searching for El Dorado, the mythical city of gold. As the expedition disintegrates around him, Aguirre's megalomania expands to fill every available space. He murders the expedition's leaders, declares himself sovereign of a new empire, and continues pushing deeper into the jungle, even as the raft carrying his soldiers drifts in circles and his men die of arrows and disease and starvation. The final image, Aguirre alone on a raft covered in monkeys, ranting about the empire he will build, is one of cinema's greatest closing shots. Herzog and Kinski's relationship was so destructive that locals from a nearby village apparently approached Herzog offering to murder Kinski for him. Herzog declined, saying he still needed him for the film. This story encapsulates something essential about what Aguirre is, a film that could only exist because its director was as obsessed as his subject. Herzog has talked about ecstatic truth, the idea that fiction can reach deeper realities than documentary. Aguirre is the clearest expression of that philosophy he ever produced. The new German cinema movement it helped define changed European filmmaking forever. The Conformist, 1970, Bernardo Bertolucci was 28 years old when he made The Conformist, and he made it look like the work of a master who had been studying light and politics and memory for a lifetime. The cinematographer Vittorio Storaro, who would later shoot Apocalypse Now and Reds, has called The Conformist the film that changed his entire understanding of what a camera could do. Francis Ford Coppola watched it repeatedly during the production of The Godfather and instructed Gordon Willis to use its visual language as a primary reference. The shadow of this film falls across some of the greatest American films of the 1970s. The story follows Marcello Clerici, a bourgeois Italian man who becomes a fascist Secret Service agent in Mussolini's Italy, partly out of genuine belief and partly because conformity feels like safety. He is sent to Paris to assassinate his former philosophy professor, now a political exile. The mission is straightforward. Nothing else in the film is. Bertolucci wraps the story in the most extraordinary visual grammar, rooms sliced by light and shadow, architecture that physically embodies fascism's aesthetics of power, a color palette that moves from the warm gold of nostalgia to the cold gray of complicity. The film was not banned outright, but faced significant resistance in Italy for its unflinching portrayal of how ordinary, reasonable men become instruments of authoritarianism. That question has not aged one day. Bertolucci framed fascism not as a monster that arrives from outside, but as a choice made by people who find the weight of individual freedom too heavy to carry. Jean-Louis Trintignant's performance as Marcello is a masterpiece of interiority. He does almost nothing. You understand everything. Roger Ebert placed it on his great movies list. It has since been recognized as a cornerstone of political cinema worldwide. Possession, 1981. It was banned in the UK under the Video Nasties list in 1983. It was refused classification in several European territories. American distributors cut nearly 40 minutes from it and released a version so incomprehensible that it was quickly forgotten. For decades, Possession existed as a rumor, a film that people described in hushed tones as something genuinely unlike anything else. They were not wrong. Andrzej Żuławski made this film immediately after a brutal divorce from his first wife, channeling that psychological devastation into something that operates simultaneously as a horror film, a domestic drama, a Cold War allegory, and a portrait of a marriage dissolving at the cellular level. Mark returns to West Berlin after a mysterious government assignment to find his wife Anna behaving in ways he cannot parse. She asks for a divorce. She becomes violent. She disappears for days. What she is concealing leads the film into territory that defies easy description. Żuławski uses the literal geography of Cold War Berlin, the wall, the checkpoints, the divided city, as a physical expression of the split psyche. Every location feels like an external manifestation of internal collapse. Isabelle Adjani won Best Actress at Cannes for her work here. Her performance in the subway scene, which lasts several minutes and shows her having what can only be described as a complete physical breakdown, is one of the most extraordinary pieces of acting ever captured on film. Adjani herself has said she does not watch it. Żuławski pushed her to places most directors would never attempt. Sam Neill, in one of his earliest major roles, matches her at every turn. When the fully restored version was finally given a proper release by Fandor and other platforms, critics who had only heard the legend watched it and confirmed, the reputation is earned. This is one of the great films of the decade, hidden in plain sight for 40 years. The Night Porter, 1974. The debate about The Night Porter has never really ended, and that might be the most honest thing you can say about it. When Liliana Cavani released this film in 1974, she became one of the first female directors to achieve major international controversy, and the critical establishment punished her for it without mercy. Feminist scholars called it exploitative. Conservative audiences called it obscene. Left-wing critics called it politically irresponsible. And yet the film refused to go away because Cavani was asking a question that nobody wanted to engage with honestly. What psychological bonds form between perpetrators and victims, and why do some of those bonds outlast the circumstances that created them? Max is a former SS officer working as a night porter in a Vienna hotel in 1957. Lucia is a Holocaust survivor who was a prisoner in his concentration camp. They recognize each other in the hotel lobby. And instead of the confrontation, the reckoning, the justice that narrative logic seems to demand, Cavani gives us something far more disturbing. They resume the relationship. Dirk Bogarde and Charlotte Rampling give performances of such controlled intensity that the film becomes almost unbearable to watch, not because of what it depicts, but because of how nakedly it refuses to judge its characters. Charlotte Rampling has said this was the most difficult and most important work of her career. Dirk Bogarde, already a major British star, accepted the role knowing it would damage his reputation. It did. Neither of them ever apologized. The film was pulled from theaters in several countries. It was condemned by survivor groups. Italian censors demanded cuts. Cavani refused. Decades later, it was reassessed as a genuinely significant work of European cinema, screened at major retrospectives, and discussed in universities as an essential text on complicity, memory, and the psychology of survival. Now streaming free. Still impossible to categorize. Last Tango in Paris, 1972. Bernardo Bertolucci appears twice on this list because 1970s European cinema does not fully make sense without understanding how completely he dominated it. Last Tango in Paris is the one that made him internationally infamous and put Marlon Brando back on the cultural map after years of difficult productions and public eccentricity. When it premiered at the New York Film Festival in October 1972, critic Pauline Kael wrote that it represented a new moment in film history, comparable to the premiere of Stravinsky's Rite of Spring. She meant it as praise. Others meant the same comparison as horror. A recently widowed American man in Paris and a young French woman meet by accident while both looking at an apartment. They begin a relationship with a single rule: no names, no histories, no personal information, pure presence. The apartment becomes a world sealed off from ordinary life. Brando improvised substantial portions of his dialogue, drawing on his own grief after the death of his wife. The emotional rawness in his performance is not entirely fictional. You can see real pain being processed in real time, and it makes certain scenes almost too intimate to watch. The Italian government prosecuted Bertolucci and confiscated the film. All involved were given suspended sentences, and Bertolucci was briefly stripped of his civil rights. The film was banned in Italy for years. Maria Schneider spent decades giving interviews about how the production damaged her, and her testimony cast a long ethical shadow over the film's legacy. Brando himself grew to despise it. And yet the central performances, the jazz score by Gato Barbieri, the Paris of Henri Alecan's cinematography, remain undeniable. Film historians continue to argue about how to hold all of it simultaneously: the art, the controversy, the harm, and the historical importance. That argument is itself a reason to watch. Come and See, 1985. Technically, 1985 falls slightly outside the 1970s, but Come and See began development in the mid-1970s and was delayed for nearly a decade by Soviet censors who found its portrait of the Second World War too psychologically devastating, too unpatriotic in its honesty, too unwilling to frame atrocity as something that can be survived with dignity intact. When it was finally released, Soviet veterans watched it and wept, not for nostalgia, for recognition. This was, they said, what it actually looked like, not the heroic version, the real one. Flyora is a Belarusian teenager who joins the Soviet resistance in 1943. Over the course of the film, he witnesses the systematic destruction of entire villages by German forces. Director Elim Klimov and co-writer Alice Adamovich compiled testimony from hundreds of survivors. The film contains no fabrications. Every atrocity depicted happened. Klimov tracked the physical and psychological transformation of his young lead, Alexei Kravchenko, across the shoot, and the boy who appears in the first scene and the face that stares out from the last are genuinely different people. The transformation is not acting. It is the film itself changing him. The opening of the Hathaway Gate scene, in which soldiers burn a village with everyone inside, was filmed with real incendiary devices. The cast and crew were in genuine danger. Klimov refused to use simulation because he wanted the terror to be real. Come and See was the Soviet submission for the Academy Award in 1986. It is consistently placed in the top 20 films ever made in international critics' polls. It represents the extreme outer limit of what cinema can do when it refuses to make violence comfortable. Streaming on multiple platforms for free. Watch it on the largest screen you have. Investigation of a Citizen Above Suspicion, 1970. The film that sits at the top of this list won the Academy Award for Best Foreign Language Film in 1971 and was simultaneously banned in several countries for being too close to the truth. Elio Petri made a political thriller so precise in its diagnosis of institutional power that it functioned less like fiction and more like a document. Italian authorities reportedly considered suppression, then decided that suppressing a film about how authority suppresses inconvenient truths would be too perfectly ironic. They were right. The film survived them. Most of the politicians it lampooned did not survive history. A senior Rome police official, a man explicitly referred to only as the inspector to emphasize his function over his identity, murders his mistress at the film's opening. He then proceeds to leave evidence pointing directly to himself throughout the subsequent investigation because he is absolutely certain he will not be prosecuted. He is a man above suspicion, not because the evidence is weak, because power protects its own. Gian Maria Volante's performance is one of the great displays of monstrous self-confidence in cinema history. He plays the inspector as a man who has completely internalized the logic of authority. Truth is irrelevant. Evidence is irrelevant. Justice is a performance staged by those who already control the outcome. Ennio Morricone composed a score that is darkly comedic, almost playful, which makes the horror of the film more suffocating rather than less. Petri had been a communist journalist before turning to film, and every frame of investigation reflects his understanding of how fascism does not announce itself with uniforms and salutes. It announces itself through bureaucracy, through the casual exercise of untouchable power, through the shared understanding among institutions that certain people are simply exempt. The film was made during the years of lead, Italy's long period of political violence and institutional corruption. But it is not a period piece. It is a blueprint. Every country that has ever watched institutions protect themselves at the expense of justice has produced the inspector. He just goes by different names. Critics in 1970 called it the most important Italian film since Fellini's 8½. It won Petri his only Oscar. He died in 1982 at 53, before he could fully understand how permanent his masterpiece would become. It streams free and it runs 92 minutes, and by the time it ends, you will feel you have been shown something that was not meant for you to see. That is precisely the point. So which of these films are you brave enough to actually watch? Drop your answer in the comments below. And here is the question that should start a fight. If a film is genuinely great art, but caused real harm to real people during its production, does it still deserve to be called a masterpiece, or does greatness have a moral precondition? Let us know exactly where you stand.